Welcome to a very special series presented by GayTalkRadio.org and QueerPublicRadio.com. In this series, Gay Talk Radio and Queer Public Radio will feature the complete audiobook Invisible Hand, written by Larry K. Mason. Although this audiobook is a fictional account, it could be true. Mr. Mason has designed this concept of a completely new monetary system which would, by itself, catapult the world into a caring, loving environment that we have all dreamed of. To explain his concept, Mr. Mason wrote this book and provides it for free on the internet. Mr. Mason decided to write this book, Invisible Hand, to explain the new system he proposes, which has the ability to change our world as we now know it. With his permission, Gay Talk Radio and Queer Public Radio present this wonderful concept for your listening pleasure and serious consideration. For more information, you may visit Mr. Mason's website at nopom.info. That's NOPOMINFO. nopom.info. On with the show.
Invisible Hand, Chapter 32, Zero Sum, in which Neil discovers that things are not what they seem with a palm, and there's work for everybody. To review what you have said so far, palms can be stolen. Our money cannot, because our money is not transferable. Palm can be used to motivate any behavior, whether good or bad. Our money is as moral as the payer's. This one gave Neil a little frisson of fear. No society can control how a palm is used when it's in the form of currency or coins. Our money is easily controllable. There are several more differences between palms and our money. Think now. D.W.'s face brightened. Counterfeiting. A physical object can be counterfeited. Palms can be faked. Our money is almost impossible to counterfeit, and even if it were, it could not be done on a large scale, or it would be obvious. Neil thought that Jean's idea about rogue payers paying themselves and living in the palm colonies could be a way that large-scale counterfeiting would not be so obvious. Very good, D.W. We can add that to the list. Who's next? The South American nations often have a problem with inflation, Layden said. With a palm, you can just print as much money as you like. It doesn't matter whether there's anything to buy or not. With our money, prices are always the same. Excellent, Layden. That's a big difference, the instructor said. With palms, the supply of money is independent of the supply of goods and services for sale. With our money, the supply of luxury goods and services for sale determines the amount of money that exists to buy things. We use the payer's adjustments of paying for benefits rather than the prices of luxury items to be our free market. Therefore, we never have inflation or deflation of our money supply. Can anybody think of another difference? There was a long pause with some shifting, but there were no hands up this time. Okay. Most classes don't get this last one, even though it might be the most important of the lot. Let's approach it gradually, and perhaps you can figure it out before I tell you. Do any of you play poker? Ah, good. If each of the players in a poker game begins the game with $100 in chips, and one of the players ends the game with $150 in chips, what do we know about the winnings and losses of the other players? D.W.'s hand went up. Somebody else must have lost $50. Yes, some one player or some combination of the other players must have lost at least $50. Why is that? Oscar said, because if you add up the losses and the winnings of all the players, the total will always be zero. In order for one player to gain some, other players must lose. If it wasn't that way, the game could go on forever. Exactly. That situation where winnings and losses have to balance out is called a zero-sum game. Is an economy a zero-sum game? Of course not, said Neil. The market is a win-win situation. In every trade, each trader gains by the trade. That's how specialization increases everyone's wealth. Quite right. Now, let's look at a palm economy's simple purchase. Layden, you will pretend to be buying a hat from Oscar. Layden, you have $20 and the hat is being offered for $15. Are you willing to pay $15 for that hat? I guess. Aren't you sure? Well, I'd like to pay less than that. It looks like it's only worth about $5, she responded. Good. So what do you say to Oscar? I'll give you $5 for the hat. Leighton smiled at Oscar. Oscar got right into the swing of things. $5? That hat is worth $25. The only reason I'm willing to part with it for only $15 is because I like you and want to encourage you to trade with me in the future. Well, I might go as high as $7 since I am in the store, Leighton countered, trying to sound reasonable. Look, I'm a poor man, merely trying to stay in business here. I guess I could go as low as $12, but it's taking the bread from the mouths of my children. Great acting, the instructor interrupted. But let's assume that the two of you finally complete the transaction at a price of $10. Tell me about your relationship. How did it feel? I was competing with Leighton, trying to get as much money as I could from her for the hat, Oscar said. The instructor quickly asked, Oscar, what was Leighton trying to do? She was trying to get the hat for as little money as possible. So, Leighton, what was your relationship to Oscar? He was my opponent. I had to make him think I would never pay more than just a few dollars. I had to pretend that I hardly cared whether I got that hat or not. He wanted all my money, so I had to be careful to see that he didn't get it. Class, who won? Did Oscar win because he got $10, or did Leighton win because she got the hat? Neil jumped in before the others could. They both won because each benefited from the trade. Yes, they both won. Both got what they wanted to some degree without harming the other. Since the trade was voluntary, they could each win. And if you extend what we just saw here to the whole economy, you will see that it optimizes the outcomes for the economy as a whole as well. But let's look at the exact same interaction and see only the money part of it. Leighton, how much money did you have to begin with? I had $20. Oscar, how much money did you have to begin? I had nothing but a hat. So the total money in the beginning was $20. How much money did you have at the end, Leighton? I had $10 left. Oscar, I had $10 and no hat. Just the money now. We're ignoring everything else, no matter how relevant or important it may be. So, looking at just the money, who gained by this transaction? Oscar did, DW said. Oscar gained $10 and Leighton lost $10. Does that sound like a zero-sum game? The instructor asked. There were general murmurs of agreement, and Neil saying, but it wasn't a zero-sum game. They both benefited from the trade. They wouldn't have made the trade if it wouldn't benefit both. I did not ask if it was a zero-sum game. I asked if, when we look just at the money, it sounds like a zero-sum game. Does the money part, looked at all by itself, look like a zero-sum game? Only because you're ignoring the other half of the trade, Neil conceded. What was the relationship between the buyer and the seller in our case of the hat? Neil said, they were trading. They were each getting what they wanted. What else? Natalie said, they were also opponents. Leighton admitted that she was trying to fool Oscar, and Oscar was trying to fool Leighton. They didn't feel like they were cooperating, even though that was the end result of what they were doing. Anything else? Oscar got the money, so he won, Clayton said. Oscar only won if the other people selling hats got less for their hats than Oscar did, Leighton said. Class, notice that we are measuring the success of the sellers here by the money they get and ignoring the costs to each and the satisfaction experienced by each. But more important, notice that even though, as Neil says, they both benefit by the trade, they each are taking a point of view of opposition to each other. This is the point of view of the zero-sum game. In order for me to win, I have to make someone else lose. If you aren't a winner, you must be a loser. In that kind of situation, what happens to those who are relatively weak? The instructor looked around the room, hoping for a new contributor. Neil, of course, was eager to answer. They both win, so as long as the market is free, they both improve their situations. Clayton turned to Neil and said, really? What if the sellers of hats get together and decide that none of them will sell a hat for less than $19? Leighton is only one person. How can she compete with price fixing of the hat sellers? At those prices, Neil said, there'll be a lot of other people willing to sell hats for a few dollars less. But you're assuming that the market stays free, Clayton said with a touch of anger. You're assuming that other people can enter the market. Since there's money to be made by keeping the prices of hats high, the hatters are motivated to punish anyone who sells hats for less. With people looking upon each other as enemies, how can you keep the market free? He finished triumphantly. The instructor asked, What has happened to those who were weak in palm economies historically? They get weaker and poorer, Wendy said. What happens to the rich and powerful? Asked the instructor. They get richer and more powerful, said D.W. Until what happens? Until the economy falls apart, said Oscar. And when the economy falls apart, the political system will not be far behind. Take the economic chaos in Russia in 1917, or in Germany in the 1920s, or look at Rome in its long decline. Whenever an economy gets rich, the wealth becomes more and more concentrated until the foundation of that economy is destroyed. In Rome, it was the middle-class farmers who formed the basis for the success of Rome. But as Rome got more powerful and more wealthy, that very class of farmers was destroyed, and the whole economy came to depend on annexing more areas and enslaving more people, until they could no longer expand and could no longer afford to pay the army to protect them. That's only because they destroyed their free market. If they had left it alone, if they had kept the government controls out of it, they could have remained strong, Natalie countered. How could they have done that, Natalie? Wendy asked quietly. How could they have prevented the rich from destroying the free market? It wasn't the rich, it was the government, Natalie maintained. Weren't the senators rich? Weren't the Caesars rich? Who paid for Julius's run for office? Who paid the armies? Clayton was definitely heated. It was always the rich. The rich were the government. They controlled it, and they ran it to benefit themselves. Regardless of whether it was the rich or the government, what difference does that make? Natalie said fiercely. Did it really matter whether it was one or the other if the free market was destroyed? Because in a palm economy, even if a society is fortunate enough to somehow approximate a free market, that freedom will always be destroyed. That's because the people can make money by destroying the freedom of the market. One can make money by forming monopolies. One can make money by making legislation favorable to one set of people over another set of people. One can lie and cheat and steal and threaten in the market. There are many ways to abuse the market, and they all make money for somebody. But it's stupid to destroy the free market, Neil said. Everybody suffers without the free market. If the government would just let the market alone, it would be better for everybody. Neil, did you ever hear the story of the monkey trap? The instructor asked. Monkey trap? No, Neil replied. Some explorers in a tropical region found some large heavy pots with small necks in the forest. They picked up some and shook them and found that they had nuts in them. When they asked the natives what they were there for, they replied that those were monkey traps. The monkeys could smell the nuts in the jars. They would reach inside and grab a handful of nuts, but then would be unable to withdraw their arms. Since the jars were heavy, the monkeys had to just stand there next to the jar until the hunters came and shot them. This shows that the hope of an immediate, relatively small gain will often cause monkeys and people to do stupid things. The immediate reward for destroying the market always proves to be too tempting for some people to resist. The money that they can make by destroying the freedom of the market will always overcome what good sense they might have. At the end of the 20th century, there were no free markets of any size left in the world, since every society had a government, and those governments always imposed limitations on their markets. The simulation of a zero-sum game that results from the use of a palm is what makes individuals think they can benefit when they make others suffer. When it's obvious that the benefits of a free market help everyone to attain their ends, why would people seek to destroy it unless they didn't understand their actual situation? Well, we're nearing the end of our time, so I'll give a brief review of the main points. Palms are transferable, therefore they can be stolen and borrowed. Palms have a physical manifestation such as currency, thus they can be counterfeited and produced in any amount, whether the goods and services exist to be bought with it or not. Inflation and deflation are possible with palms. Palms are used by everybody. Thus, their use cannot be controlled, so their use encourages moral, immoral, and amoral behavior depending on what the money is offered for. Palms simulate a zero-sum game, causing people to think they are independent of each other when they are really dependent on each other. Neil's hand shot up. Neil, we can deal with that next time. Our money is not transferable, so it cannot be stolen, and there is no credit or loans of our money. Our money is given only by payers, so the behavior it motivates is as moral as the payers make it. Our money does not simulate a zero-sum game, since it emphasizes that if others benefit, we benefit. It makes obvious our interdependence. After class, Neil was still fired up to talk about the points covered in class, and since he didn't have another class for 2 hours, he asked Oscar if he would like to continue the discussion in the cafeteria. Oscar grinned in acceptance, and they set out in search of food. Seriously, Oscar said, we actually were spending over 25% of our human resources on maintaining the money. Of course, you'd think of cashiers, bookkeepers, accountants, and tax lawyers as not being needed anymore, But there were also no need for banks, insurance, and stock markets. Whole industries were no longer needed. When you add to that the number of people in government who were no longer needed to enforce various laws or distribute welfare, it added up to over 25% of the workforce. Then, too, there were all those buildings and janitors and computers and paper and office furniture and on and on and on. There were millions of people suddenly out of work. What did they do? At first, there were a lot of scared people. But then they discovered that a lot of things that people weren't paid to do before, they could get paid for now. Child rearing, for example, generated a continuing income for mothers and some fathers. Homeschooling mothers in particular had a pretty nice income. The contractors who did road work and infrastructure construction suddenly were recruiting everybody they could who could do the work, since the streets and dams and bridges and such had been neglected for decades. There was construction going on all over. The folks who built equipment and supplies for the contractors had a huge surge in requests for materials and tools. Contractors also did very well in the housing industry and renovating old buildings. There were lots of office buildings that were converted to other uses. But what about those bankers and insurance salesmen and bookkeepers and such? They weren't going to make construction workers. What could they do? The accountants and bookkeepers discovered that there were lots of things that need to be kept track of and organized. Inventory still needs to be monitored. The bankers found that their skills in recognizing good investments were quite useful in helping the capital producers decide how to distribute their resources. In a lot of cases, the bankers only needed a little education to make excellent coordinators. The people who were well educated enough to be comptrollers and financial officers and such found it easy to adapt to the new economy. They had lots of skills that were useful. What's a coordinator? Neil asked. It was a job category with which he was unfamiliar. They bring together people who could cooperate to accomplish some large project and make sure the information that each needs about the others is available at the right time and place. Like, if you're going to build a house, you would need lumber and tools and nails and plumbing and wiring and cement and shingles and people who know how to build with and install all those things. They would need to have the materials show up at the right time and place, and the various people who would work with them would need to get there at the right time and have the plans available so they would know what they were going to be doing. They would all have to agree ahead of time. The coordinator sees to all those things. When things go wrong, as they almost always do on any complicated enterprise, they are the ones who get the resources, human and otherwise, that are needed to make things work. For some big projects, you might have several layers of coordinators, each with their own specialty. Naturally, the Internet is an enormous help, since they can advertise for what they need and when. Why do people obey them? Neil asked. Nobody obeys them. They can't give orders. Well, they could, but if you disobeyed, they certainly couldn't do anything about it. They provide information. If you know that by showing up first thing in the morning next Tuesday and installing plumbing at the house being built at 1433 Maple Street, you could expect to get paid for the benefit for years. Then you have a good reason to do the work. If you said you were going to do that job and then just didn't show up, there would be some declarations about you in your references file. If you were willing and able to do a good job and you let it be known that you're available, you will probably be contacted by several coordinators with work you can do. The better you get, the more important the projects that you will be offered. What if they make a mistake? Then they look bad and people are less likely to want to work on the projects they try to put together. But everybody makes mistakes, and since you can get paid pretty good for fixing things after a mistake, there are always lots of folks around who will try to help out. How do they find projects to do? Oscar scratched his head. I really don't know. I suspect that people bring them ideas, and other coordinators probably just look for problems that need solving. Lots of those in the building trades had training as architects or civil engineers. There are also a lot of them who used to be contractors. What about big projects like a dam or a large bridge? If a project takes years to complete, do all those guys not get paid anything until it's done? That's right. But when you have finished, the pay comes rolling in regularly and you don't have to lift a finger. It all depends on whether you want a little now or a lot later. Those big projects also attract a lot of people as they get near to completion, since the payoff is nearer. Invisible Hand, Chapter 33, Self-Betrayal, in which we meet Mr. Sharp and his staff, and Neil tells the truth, perhaps at some cost. He was rather portly, and wore what looked like a silk suit under a flowing cape. He had a carnation in his buttonhole, and his shoes shone with an almost inner glow. He had a large ring on his left hand that must have had over 2 carats of diamonds around a large ruby. He walked into the classroom, saw the chair behind the table, snorted, and gestured to someone in the hallway. An older man in a chauffeur's uniform pushed in on a dolly a rather large reclining chair and positioned it beside the table. "Thanks, Reggie, that should do," he said, and the man in uniform took the dolly with him as he left. Rotating his large paunch toward the class, he seemed to examine each of the expectant faces before him, then grimaced and turned away toward the chair. "Open," he said, seeming to address the chair. It obediently tilted itself toward him and rose up to receive his considerable bulk. He leaned back into the leather-covered cushions, and the chair gently adjusted its position until his movements indicated satisfaction. For a moment he closed his eyes and seemed about to take a nap. Then he roused himself, tilted slightly forward, and addressed the class. "I am Mr. Sharp. I'll never be a payer. I earned my wealth, and I don't intend ever to give it up. But I know how the payer organization works, and you need to know as well. The payer organization is both a bureaucracy and a free market. Until you understand how it can be both of these things at the same time, you will never understand it." He smacked his lips a couple of times, sighed, and continued. "How is it a bureaucracy? It has a hierarchical structure composed of offices. That is the essence of bureaucracy. There is a considerable division of labor within the organization." He seemed to be reciting by rote something memorized, and his tone became lower and quieter. "Most payers are rather highly specialized. Their actions are coordinated by those above them in the hierarchy. Some of the people in this hierarchy are not payers, of course, but their skills are needed to operate the hierarchy. Where possible, payers do the administrative work, still called paper shuffling, even though there is little actual paper left in administration." He gave a slight smile and lowered his gaze from the ceiling to which it had slowly migrated. He smacked his lips again and licked them slightly. This time the sigh was even larger, puffing his cheeks. "You can call the payer organization offices and someone answers the phone. You can ask questions and get information. You can praise or complain. There are buildings of payer offices, though most payers don't have offices." He paused again in his rather dry lecture. One hand rubbed his belly for a moment. "Reggie!" "Right here, sir," came from the hallway, and Reggie reappeared, now wearing what appeared to be the garb of a bartender from the 1890s, complete with apron and garter belts holding his sleeves. He carried in one hand a small table, and in the other a tall, elegant glass and a brown bottle with beads of moisture beginning to condense on its surface. In a few seconds, Reggie had placed the table beside Mr. Sharp and placed the glass and bottle side by side on the table within easy reach. Then he took a bottle opener from his pocket and placed it next to the still-sealed bottle and left the room. Mr. Sharp looked achingly at the goods on the table, then turned resolutely away. "From just looking at the offices and watching what goes on there, you would never know that the people involved were payers except for the way they dress. But these bureaucrats oversee a tremendous information processing and communications organization." His gaze wandered back to the bottle and then away again to the class. "Billions of facts are processed daily around the clock. They keep track of all the luxury items in the economy and most of the capital goods. They keep track of most of the people as producers and all the people as consumers, including the payers." He smacked his lips a couple more times, glanced furtively at the bottle, and continued. "The hierarchy is a huge locus of power within the economy, somewhat similar to, but much larger than any authoritarian government. The influence of the organization extends from the highest councils of the largest enterprises to the simplest producer of homemade goods. Decisions made in the organization influence the directions that the economy will take quite strongly." Sitting up suddenly to an almost upright position, with the cooperation of the chair, he suddenly barked, "Do you believe that the payer organization is a bureaucracy?" There was a startled nodding of heads and murmurs of agreement. "Whew! That calls for a sip, I believe." From his now upright position, he turned eagerly toward his reward. Grasping the bottle in his left hand and the opener in his right, he caressingly and lovingly drew off the metal cap from the bottle. Then, returning the opener to the table, he took the bottle in his right hand, the glass in his left, and began the pour, a look of delight, almost rapture on his face. The golden liquid slipped quietly, gently, and smoothly into the bottom of the curved glassware, curling and bubbling with delighted effervescence at its release from captivity. Closing his eyes, he brought the glass to his lips and, sighing with pleasure, took the first sip, then a larger one. Carefully placing the glass once again on its coaster, he turned toward the class and issued an enormous belch. "All right, that was the easy part," he said, leaving the class in doubt as to whether he was referring to the beer and the belch or the explanation. "The payers look like an organization, even down to nearly wearing a uniform. Their offices look like offices. But they don't look like a free market, do they? A puzzled shaking of heads and murmurs of no was his answer. Are there any of you who do not know what supply and demand are? Never mind, you probably don't know even if you think you do. A market is a situation in which trade takes place. Notice, I did not say it was a place. Thousands of years ago, a market had a particular location. People brought to such places what they were willing to offer and found there others with goods to exchange. Today, you don't have to be near someone in order to give them something or get something from them. Therefore, a market today is a situation, not a location. It is an opportunity to exchange with other people. Do payers exchange with each other? He asked, eyeing them warily. After a moment of hesitation, there was a shaking of heads and murmurs of no. He sighed hugely. He shook his head and looked to the heavens, or at least to the ceiling. Then he confronted them. Do pairs exchange with each other? What do they have to exchange? He barked. Money? We will omit the name of the party who gave this foolish answer to protect the guilty. You people are going to be payers? We'll never survive it. You'll destroy the economy. Mr. Sharp groaned in a magnificent display of disappointment. Payers can't give money to each other, Oscar said. Bravo, he said, slowly clapping his hands in sarcastic applause. What do payers have to exchange? He repeated, staring at them one after another with a scowl. Knowledge? Natalie offered. There, he smiled serenely. That wasn't so hard, was it? Knowledge, information. What must a payer have to do his job? Knowledge and information. A payer has to be aware of benefits and costs. A payer has to understand how things are interrelated. Could you walk out there right now, see some benefit, and know whom to pay and how much? I don't think so. You'd need a lot more information and probably more knowledge than you have now. Each of you has information and can gather more. You have knowledge gained over the course of your respective lifetimes. Some of you know about one or more kinds of work. You may have been a bricklayer, he said, pointing at Layden, who giggled in response. You may have been a secretary, he said, directing his gaze at Neil, who bowed slightly from the waist in acknowledgement with a grin. You may have been a stay-at-home father, he said, sighing in the general direction of Oscar, whose eyes got big. You may have been a farmer, he inquired of Wendy, whose broad smile and nod indicated he wasn't far from wrong. Whatever things you did with your life, you should have learned from it. You should have some understanding of how things work. Your fellow payers need your knowledge and understanding just as you need theirs. When you eat at the lunchroom, you can notice what foods people prefer and which they avoid. A few of you may have some idea of the nutritional value of the various offerings. Mr. Sharp paused, looked at the still half-full glass, then reached for it again. This drink was only a couple of swallows. He looked almost at the point of tears as he contemplated how little of the golden liquid remained in the glass. Then, getting control of himself, he resolutely turned back to the class and continued. If some payers needed to know what food was eaten and what the nutritional value of that eaten food was, you might have that information for them. Therefore, you can exchange with them, discovering from them what you need to know and giving to them some of what they need to know. This is exchange, people. This is give and take. This is trade. There is also information you need in order to coordinate your actions with the actions of the other payers. For example, where would your knowledge and information be most useful to the other payers? How much money should you have available to pay for certain kinds of benefits? What proportion of the pay for an organization should go to the various roles played in that organization? Grimacing, he went back to his bored lecture tone and rocked his head from side to side as he almost recited, In a hierarchy, orders flow from the top down. What flows back up? Information, Oscar announced, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Well, you're getting better, Mr. Sharp sounded somewhat surprised. Yes, information flows up the hierarchy. Why does information flow up? The people at the top want to know what's happening so they can make good decisions, D.W. said. Do the people at the top get accurate information? Layden said, No. They hear what they want to hear. Their lackeys learn to tell them just what they want to hear. What else? Neil said, Information acquires what you might call static along the way. Every time information goes from person A to person B, some of it is lost and misunderstanding creeps in. The signal-to-noise ratio gets worse. "All right," the instructor said, taking the last sip of his tall, cool one, now departed. "What does this mean for an organization, especially one as big as the payers?" There was a painful pause as the class digested the implications of what they had just heard. They were relieved to see Reggie reappear to take away the table and the empty containers, for it gave them time to think. Finally, Neil said, "The people at the top who make the decisions don't have the information they need to make those decisions. Therefore, at best, they're making informed guesses." "Therefore?" the instructor said, raising an eyebrow. Layden said thoughtfully, "Therefore, those at the top shouldn't be making the decisions." "That seems obvious, doesn't it?" The instructor gave a beatific smile, looking from certain angles like an overgrown cherub in an expensive suit. "The people at the top should not be making the decisions," he continued. "So how can decisions be made if you don't have someone at the top making them?" "Elections," Clayton burst out. "Decisions can be made by voting." "Good! Does the payer organization make any decisions by elections?" "Yes, we had that in our history course," Natalie said. "We categorize products and services as luxuries, capital, and necessities by the votes of samples drawn from all the payers. We also use elections to decide on the prices of luxuries. We also use elections to decide on the proportions of the available money to allocate to various benefits." Neil jumped in. "How are those votes? They're more like surveys or polls of the payers. The people who design the questionnaires and who interpret the answers can get whatever result they want. The people at the top are still making the decisions. They just don't want to admit it." "Okay, Neil. Let's take these three kinds of elections or surveys one at a time and see how they work. First, the categorizing of products and services. This is a simple question. Is this item a luxury, a necessity, or capital? Do you see some way to bias that question? More importantly, do you see some advantage to anyone for categorizing some item one way or another?" "Sure," Layden put in. "If the item's a necessity, the payers get to have it. That gives them an incentive to make luxuries into necessities." "I think we all agree that's true. That's an incentive to label all consumer goods as being necessities. How will people treat payers if there are a few luxuries?" "I don't know." "Well, you do realize that the amount of money the payers can pay is determined by the amount of luxury goods and services available for sale. So if almost every consumer good and service is a necessity, the payers will have almost no money to pay with. What would that do to the respect and attention payers now get?" "I guess that wouldn't be so good for us," Layton admitted. "Let's take clothes, for example. What if all clothes were labeled as necessities? How could you distinguish a payer from anybody else?" Layton looked quickly down at her hand-decorated stockings. "You couldn't," Neil said. "Let's consider another, even more basic point, the proportion of people in the population who are payers. If people don't have to give up much to become a payer, then there should be a lot more people who are willing to become payers for the power. That could result in far too many payers and therefore far too little respect and power and goods, for that matter, to go around. If too many things are labeled as necessities, there would be too many payers. The payers wouldn't like that, so they have incentives to keep the list of necessities within bounds. But by far the most important reason why not too many things are labeled as necessities is that the other people in the society wouldn't like it," Mr. Sharp continued. "Payers have to live among the common people and are, therefore, quite sensitive to how other people feel about things, especially how they feel about payers. The payers fear appearing greedy. Therefore, there is a balance between incentives to make more things necessities and more things luxuries. Those random samples of the payers assure that we come pretty close to the sentiments of the society as a whole when those decisions are made. Reggie, please." Once again, Reggie appeared in the doorway. This time he appeared in the guise of a head waiter in a luxury restaurant, and in addition to a pristine white cloth over his left arm, he carried a bowl from which there issued visible evidence of hot water and the most enticing of aromas. He brought the tempting prize close to Mr. Sharp's face and gently wafted the aroma toward his client. Mr. Sharp's eyes closed slowly, then snapped open. "Bread! What breads have we?" Reggie reached into a pocket, drew out a brown card, and handed it to Mr. Sharp with a small bow. Mr. Sharp viewed it critically and made his selections. Reggie accepted the return of the card with another small bow and departed, taking the bowl of soup with him. Mr. Sharp looked lingeringly after Reggie, or perhaps after the soup, and then turned once again to the class. "The next kind of election is the kind that sets prices for luxury items. This is more of a calculation in many respects, since the payers try to set the prices at what it costs to produce the good or service. The use of a large sample of payers makes use of what has been called the Delphi effect. This is the tendency of a large sample of people to be better at predicting the future accurately than any individual, no matter how expert. The questions on these surveys are, this is the item, these are the resources used to create it, what should the price be? As you can see, it's difficult to imagine slanting such a question in any particular direction. Besides, the closer the payers come to setting the price at the actual cost of production, the more wealth there is for everyone else and the better people will like the payers. Therefore, there is no incentive to try to cheat in some direction. Even the producers of the luxuries maximize their own pay if the prices are set at production costs. Do you see? Yes, sir. Your description raises quite a number of other questions, but I do see that there is little opportunity for bias and no motivation for attempting to bias the results, Neil nodded. Moving on, then, to the last kind of election. We get the allocation of money to various kinds of benefits. Here is where you see the most scope for cheating, right, Neil? Yes, I do. Those who produce steel want more money for steel. Those who produce cloth want more money for cloth. There must be lobbying and pressure groups and everything. But, Neil, they are allocating money for kinds of benefits, not for kinds of products. The allocations are for such things as environmental protection, health, education, and security. How can you tell what product will help each of those benefits? I would imagine that steel, for example, would contribute to all of them, depending on how it is used and how it is produced. The same thing holds for cloth. What kind of work did you do last? I worked at the Los Alamos computer facility, which would help everything, but before that I drove a truck for a TDP plant, which mostly made oil, gas, fertilizer, and electricity, Neil answered. Is there any benefit you can think of that the production of energy would not contribute to? What benefit or benefits would you have lobbied for? Neil paused and then said reluctantly, I don't know. Now, let's suppose that the allocation is made for a month, and then something unexpected happens, like, say, a volcano erupting on the west coast. Do the payers have to stick with their former decision? Do they need permission to begin paying for benefits that were not expected to be needed when the decision was made? Clearly, the payers' individual decisions will adapt and adjust to the circumstances in which they find themselves. Therefore, the allocation of money to the various kinds of benefits is more in the nature of the setting of policy rather than the creating of a budget. By this time, the entire class was being distracted by the aroma of fresh-baked bread coming into the room from the hallway. Reggie and two helpers dressed as waiters now brought in another larger table which fitted exactly over the large chair in which Mr. Sharp semi-reclined. The table had a fine linen cloth, almost painfully white, and was graced by silver, china, and crystal. Reggie brought up the rear with a silver soup tureen. As he placed it on the table in a prominent position, the others hurried out and back with containers from which the bread aromas were issuing, plus what looked like butter and a set of jam pots. Several kinds of bread were taken from their containers and placed about the table. Reggie picked up the ladle and the thick bowl that was in front of Mr. Sharp and proceeded to spoon 2 portions of the soup into the bowl. Placing it before Mr. Sharp, he once again bowed slightly and withdrew. Steam rose gently from the various foods, and moisture condensed on the crystal goblet, which seemed to contain water. Neil's stomach gurgled loudly, which broke the mood of the class into one of amusement. Mr. Sharp continued the presentation while selecting a bread and spreading it with the softened butter and some of the jam. Do you see how these kinds of decisions can be made by payer votes or surveys? Okay, I will accept that they can make meaningful decisions by these so-called elections, at least until I can think of a reason not to, Neil grinned. The instructor took a large bite of bread, readjusted his bulk in the recliner, then addressed the class. We are considering how the payer organization is both a bureaucracy and a free market. So far, we have easily observed that the organization is a bureaucracy, but we have not seriously discussed the issue of the free market aspects of that organization. After a pause to address the soup with a gentle and graceful dip of his spoon, he continued. The first step in that direction was to point out that the organization is controlled by the information that moves up the organization, both in the sense of reporting to superiors, which is standard operating procedure for bureaucracies, but also in the sense of making decisions of various kinds through elections. The main thing I want you to notice is that the organization is really controlled from below. That is, its policies and directions and major decisions are made by these surveys and samples of the membership. This is the mechanism by which the free market aspects of the organization become important. More bread and a couple of sips of still hot soup were enjoyed. A free market operates by individual traders doing what seems best for themselves without having to take into account artificial restrictions, limitations, and controls. Gravity is a restriction on us all, sadly, he said, glancing down at the bulk of his midsection. But it's not an artificial restriction. The encroachment of laws controlling trade is an artificial restriction. A monopoly is an artificial restriction. Taxes are an artificial restriction. In a free market, the only thing one must take into account is one's own best interests. One can give when one decides it is best, and keep when one decides that is best. Take the role of a producer in our economy. You provide work of some sort. Who is able to buy your work? Everyone who has money to spend, Neil said. No, Clayton said. People with money to spend can't give it to you. It's the payers who can give you money. Neil felt a little hot in the cheeks. The instructor said, So only the payers can give you money? Of course. Neil just isn't used to our money quite yet. He's only been in the country for about 6 months, Oscar said, leaning over to punch Neil gently on the shoulder. Does that mean that there is only one buyer for your work? No, Layden said. Any of the payers can pay you for your work. There are millions of payers. So we have millions of payers who buy work and millions of producers who sell their work. Are the payers controlled or artificially restricted in what they buy or what they pay for it? This is a crucial question, so consider it carefully. The class respectfully was quiet for a while, which gave Mr. Sharp an opportunity to devote more attention to his soup, which still needed cooling. Neil was one of the first to hold up his hand to give an answer. I think we just discussed the decisions of the payer organization that tells the payers how much they can pay as an organization and what they are to pay for. Therefore, I would say the controls and restrictions are artificial. There was a pause, and the instructor looked around the room with one raised eyebrow. Finally, Natalie said, Okay, I'll take the other side. I say that those controls are natural and are part of the market itself. The instructor raised his hand and said, I expect full participation. You may switch sides of the argument at will, but I want to hear well-reasoned arguments on both sides. This is how you can show me that you understand the payer organization and its functioning. Since the organization does make decisions, and since it is a bureaucracy, the burden of proof will be with those who contend that the controls and restrictions are natural. Who would like to go first? Natalie? And he applied himself to what was left of his snack. We discussed it in another class, that the payers are free to pay as they want to pay. That is, they must take the consequences of their payments, but there is no law that controls their paying, and there never will be, since that would cost the legislators money. If no one else has a rebuttal to that statement, I will recognize Neil. Good. Clayton? Just because the government doesn't have a law or any enforcement mechanism doesn't mean there can't be other sources of artificial controls. The payers' organization could create artificial controls internally. My daddy used to tell me about how the union leaders would manipulate what were supposed to be democratic organizations. Will you let that stand? Is there any reason to reject that assertion? Come on, think. Oscar? If the payer organization is to institute a control or restriction, it would have to have some way of enforcing that restriction. It would have to have some means of punishing a payer who diverged from the others. The payers cannot employ force, such as corporal punishment, since that would be against the law, and other payers would pay to have that law enforced. Thus, the only kind of punishment that would be available would be social condemnation or ostracism or something like that. These responses are natural, like gravity, and not artificial, like laws. Response? Clayton again? But the organization could come up with rules and code them into the computer. In fact, we've all taken classes in how to make a payment and the procedures that must be followed in such cases. These are restrictions on the payers that are set by the organization, and the computer enforces them. Come on, someone besides Oscar. Yes, Wendy. The computer is not restricting how much a payer can pay, nor is it controlling who can be paid so long as one is not trying to pay another payer. The computer is more like a cash register than an enforcement agency. The computer will not limit the decisions that the payers make individually or in groups for large payments concerning what should be paid or how much. Therefore, it doesn't restrict nor restrain trade between payers and workers. Rebuttal, anyone? Neil, is there some way in which the payer organization controls or restricts the payments which individual payers or groups of payers can make? Mr. Sharp paused, waiting for another comment and taking another bite of his diminishing bread supply. Finally, "Okay, what does restrict the size of the payments?" "The production of luxuries," several voices said. "What limits does a payer have in paying?" "They do have a limit for individual payments, but so does every trader in a palm market. Nobody has unlimited funds," Wendy said. "So, from the point of view of the producer, the payers constitute a large market for the work producers do. Are the payers free to buy what they wish, so long as they stay within their budgets?" There was general agreement. "Does that mean that, from the producer's point of view, there is a free market?" "No," said Neil forcefully. "There is no trade between individual workers or producers and individual payers. The workers give things to other people, and the payers give things to the workers. That isn't a trade." "Reggie?" "Yes, sir," Reggie said, appearing in the doorway, looking every inch as one would imagine a very correct butler, right up to the white tie and tails. "My feet hurt, Reggie." "Right away, sir," Reggie responded and went out the door. "Neil, is there anything about a free market that requires that the exchanges of goods and services must be between pairs of people? Can there not be an exchange in which person A gives something to person B, and person B gives something to person C, and person C gives something to person A? That's a three-party exchange in which each party is giving something and each party is getting something, but there's no direct exchange between any two of them. If there are no artificial restrictions on that exchange, wouldn't that be an example of a free market at work?" "But it isn't trade," Neil maintained. Reggie appeared, not quite so correctly dressed, with a waistcoat, tasteful though not subdued, and white gloves, followed by what looked to be a Balinese dancing girl. By her costume, though without the rings and long fingernails, she carried what appeared to be a carpet-bag. "But is it a market, and is it free? If people are exchanging goods and services freely, isn't that situation a free market?" Reggie moved the table aside and knelt at Mr. Sharp's feet, gently removing his shoes. Then he carefully drew off the socks that covered the feet. "You can call it whatever you like, but it isn't trade. Trade is between two parties, just two. It isn't a merry-go-round of gifts or whatever you call them," Neil said, trying to ignore the operations at the feet of the instructor. "We'll call it a free market, then. Next, consider a free market in a palm economy. You will have to imagine a hypothetical free market there, since there are no industrial economy free markets that use physical object monies. In every case, there are both formal restrictions like laws and informal and often illegal restrictions like monopolies and cartels. So, in a palm free market, the producer brings something to the market to trade. If it's a product, the producer will offer it for sale, presumably at the prevailing market price or a little higher, and wait to see if anyone is willing to offer that much money for his particular product. If no one does, the producer may reduce the asking price. If someone does offer the asked-for price, a trade of money for goods may take place." By this time, Reggie had taken the table with the remains of Mr. Sharp's light repast from the room, and the young woman had opened her bag and withdrawn several small bottles and jars. "In our economy, the payer is in the position of the palm consumer, in the sense that the payer enters the market with money to offer for a certain kind of benefit, presumably at the prevailing market amount for that benefit. If no producer is willing to provide that benefit, then the payer may decide to increase the amount that she is willing to pay. Do you see the parallels here? Do you see how the payer and the producer each have choices in how to invest their respective resources? The producer can invest his work in the production of any benefit he chooses. The payer can invest his money in any producer he chooses." The woman had made her selections from among the items in front of her, and opening one, she put a small quantity of something that smelled exotic in her palm, placed her other palm over it for a few moments, then with her fingertips she began to apply the material to the soles of Mr. Sharp's feet. The strokes were slow and light. "Wait, this isn't the same at all," Neil burst out. "The payer doesn't come to an agreement with the producer on how much the producer will be paid for the benefit. There's no contract between them. The producer doesn't even know for sure which payer will pay him or whether he will be paid at all. The payers are not required to pay him, even if he deserves it. The producer is totally at the mercy of the payers. And when the payers do pay, the producer cannot very well take back his work and say that he isn't willing to do the work for that little amount of money. It isn't like the palm free market at all." Next, the girl took a jar from which she dipped a small quantity of a white cream, which again she warmed between her hands before applying it to the tops of Mr. Sharp's feet. The scent from the cream was hardly noticeable, but reminded one of tropical flowers. "You're right, Neil. that the markets are not identical, but they are not as different as you appear to believe. The payers do pay after the fact, just like the businesses that pay commissions or the stores that accept things for sale on consignment. If a salesman doesn't sell any of the product, he doesn't get paid, just like a worker today whose efforts don't provide any net benefit. If an artist places several of his pictures with a gallery and the pictures don't sell, then the artist gets no money. In neither case is there a contract saying that the salesman will have a certain income just for trying to sell, nor a contract that the artist will be paid for having produced paintings even though no one wants them. Do you see these parallels? Sure, but so what? That still doesn't make the payers and the producers a free market. They aren't a market at all because there are no trades, said Neil the Rock. By now the woman was massaging Mr. Sharp's foot, pressing firmly with her thumbs on the sole and flexing and bending it in a variety of directions. Yet the producers get money for the work they do, just like in a free market, right? No, in a free market the producers are paid by their customers. In this economy they are paid by the payers. It's not the same. If you work in a large business in a palm economy, who is paying you? For that matter, who is the owner? The company pays me. It doesn't matter who the owner is. It's probably a lot of people who own stock in the company. So the payers correspond to the company, don't they? The company pays you through its representatives in the payroll department, just like the payer organization pays you through its individual representatives. The money doesn't belong to the payers, just like the guys in payroll don't own the money they distribute. The stockholders who do collectively own the money you're given don't even know what you've done to deserve it. So you can't really say that you're doing any kind of direct person-to-person trade with them. Yet you are exchanging your work for their money. That sounds very much like a worker being paid by payers to me. You will notice that the company was given the characteristics of a person by the law. Therefore, before the law, it is still two people trading directly with each other. Neil felt that he was on a roll, and he was becoming used to the woman's presence at the feet of Mr. Sharp. All right, let's try another approach. In a palm free market, the participants each give up some things and get some things. In each exchange, the trader can agree to the trade or reject the trade. There exists no authority to deny one the opportunity to bargain with whomever one likes. You may not get the trade you want, but that would be because the other traders rejected your offers, not because some outside agency prevented them. Do you agree with this description of a palm free market? Having finished her massaging, the woman beckoned toward the doorway. Reggie reappeared, still in his valet costume, with a large bowl and a fluffy white towel over his arm. Yes, that sounds right to me, Neil acknowledged. In our economy, people also give up things and get things. When people give up things in our economy, do they get to choose what to give up? Have you seen any case of someone having their property taken by some authority? I know that there is still occasionally theft and armed robbery, but have you seen anything taken by force by an agency of the society? Reggie commenced to wash and dry Mr. Sharp's feet. No, and I must agree that I haven't heard of any cases either. I've been in a couple of situations in which I was expecting property to be taken by the authorities, and it was not, Neil said magnanimously. Have you spent money in our economy? The instructor asked. Yes, I have done so several times. Was there any restrictions on what you could buy imposed by the payer or any third party? Neil was now on the horns of a dilemma. If he told the truth about the judge's sentence of no more alcohol, he would have to reveal that he was not actually here to become a payer. On the other hand, he really didn't want to lie to these people, many of whom had become his friends. After a brief pause for thought, he decided to tell the truth. Yes, there are. I committed an assault while under the influence of alcohol. The judge gave me a choice of sentences. The one I accepted involved not drinking again while in the court's jurisdiction. Therefore, I am restricted to non-alcoholic beverages by the court. Neil thought he might have heard a few small gasps behind him, but from one or more of the other students. But you were given a choice of sentences, and some of the choices involved your buying alcohol, right? Yes. Then you chose to stop buying alcohol, the instructor continued. Yes. Therefore, I ask if you now know of any other case in which some authority limited your choices of what to buy. Not that I recall. Then would you say that you are free to buy what you like with your money? I guess so. So, in our economy, you give what you choose and buy what you choose. Is that also true in a palm free market? The instructor asked. Yes, and you have a lot more choices of things to buy in the palm free market. Here you can't buy capital or necessities, Neil pointed out. With clean feet, Reggie drew on a fresh pair of socks and replaced the patent leather shoes which had been warmed and brought in by one of the former waiters. Do you have to accept capital or necessities if they're offered to you in our economy? Well, no. Do you have to offer anyone capital or necessities even if they really need them? Neil remembered Jean in court trying to demand that he be allowed to live in the unoccupied house. No. So these changes of possession are free as well, even if they are not direct trades. I suppose so, Neil conceded. So whether they're actual trades in your way of thinking about it, all the transfers of goods and services from one person to another in our economy are done freely and without coercion being involved in any way? The instructor closed in for the kill. Yes, I suppose they are. At least I haven't been coerced or threatened by anyone since I got back in this country. Then whatever you choose to call our way of exchanging goods and services, the exchanges are all free. Now I suggest to you that most people would be willing to call that a free market. I further suggest to you that the same forces that shape a palm free market also shape the relationships between payers and those they pay. Supply and demand rules in both cases. Tomorrow we will explore that aspect. You might do some thinking about supply and demand, Neil, before our next class. I find that your objections are making these issues much clearer to the others. Dismissed! Open! To his chair, which brought him into an upright position. He leaned forward onto his feet, turned, and strode out the door with a swirl of his cape. Behind him, Neil turned to look at his classmates. No one would meet his eyes. Invisible Hand, Chapter 34, Oscar Confesses, in which Neil is rejected, accepted, and reflected. That evening, Neil was a little worried as he approached the barracks after the evening meal. His classmates had seemed a little shocked to find that he was a convicted felon, or whatever assault and battery was. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he should expect. He had eaten alone in the cafeteria. The only people who had come to his table had been people who were not in the class. When he entered the lobby where everyone gathered for the bull sessions before bed, the room quieted noticeably, so he went on through to his room and sat on the bed for a minute. Had he really blown it when he confessed his crime? Would they reject him now that they knew? Was he now in Coventry to be shunned and ignored whenever possible? What could he do about it if that were the case? You can't force people to be nice to you. Well, if he hid in his room all night, it would be the same as being shunned. He might as well find out right up front if he was to be considered persona non grata or still a human being and a friend. He combed his hair again, chewed a breath mint, no point in giving them any other excuse to dislike him, squared his shoulders, and practically marched into the hall and onward to the lounge. Once again the sound level dropped when he entered. Some heads swiveled his way, and others studiously did not look his way. It wasn't good, but perhaps it wasn't disaster either. He saw an empty chair and headed toward it, trying to appear casual and feeling anything but. He sat, and the group of 3 became a collection of 4. He looked at each of the others, but they each looked away. The silence in his immediate vicinity slowly spread to the others in the room. Now all the heads were turning his way. He felt his face growing hot. His stomach felt hollow despite just having eaten. He momentarily wished he had not eaten quite so much. "What have I done?" he asked. "I'm still the same guy I was yesterday." "But you aren't what we thought you were," Natalie said. "Sure, we knew you were in the Middle East and you might have had to do violent things, but this isn't the Middle East. You don't need to do violent things here. I asked about you and found you hit a bartender for refusing to sell you another drink after you were already drunk. You didn't need to do that. That was just plain you, in vino veritas." There was a murmur of agreement and some nodding of heads around the room. A few of the faces were showing some signs of anger. Oscar, who had been sitting alone on the other side of the room, said in a rather loud voice, "May I say something before we string Neil up by his thumbs? First of all, I have to confess that I am not what I suppose I appear to be either. What do you think I was before I came here, Natalie?" "I don't know, a businessman, a lawyer, a professor?" "Anyone else care to guess?" Oscar said, looking around the room. "An undertaker," D.W. said quickly and got a good tension-relieving laugh. "You're pretty close, D.W. I was a preacher. I had a small congregation in what you would probably call a fundamentalist church. I doubt that you ever heard of the denomination because there never were more than a few thousand of us. So far, so good. There's nothing wrong with being a man of God if you are a man of God. I was a man who used people's faith in God. I won't try to tell you that hitting a man in the face with your fist is a good thing, because it's a really bad thing. But there are worse things a person can do. There are pains one can inflict which go far deeper than the bones of the face. The face will heal, and I am sure that the bartender will be more careful about how much booze he sells to tipsy customers. Oscar's small smile gradually faded and his head dropped. I used people, taking advantage of their faith in God and twisting it for my own ends. I strongly opposed the new money when the idea was first becoming popular. I gave fiery sermons against it. I told my people it was the work of Satan. I said it would result in gross immorality, that poor men and women would stop working to live off the work of others while living lives of debauchery. I told them their teenagers would leave home to get away from their authority and fall into lives of sin. But what was I really afraid of? I'll tell you, I was afraid they wouldn't be able to give me their money anymore. I wouldn't be able to talk little old ladies into giving me their retirement money to build a bigger church. Sure, I believed in God and in sin and hell, but that never seemed to stop me from doing things in His name that now shame me. My home cost over $500,000. I had a place at the beach and one in the mountains. I was often at the country club. I gave sermons on my radio show about the evils of wealth and how those who stored up treasures on earth could not have treasures in heaven. I preached about the rich young ruler who gave up all to follow Christ. Meanwhile, I gave up nothing and followed no higher principle than greed. My wealth included a beautiful wife and 3 children. At the time of the transition, my daughter was 16 and my sons 14 and 11. My daughter was a cheerleader and very popular in school. Everything seemed to be going my way. The new money represented a threat to all that I possessed. I could envision the new church that was just beginning construction never being completed. Sponsors for my radio show would stop advertising. I still owed quite a bit of money on the house and the other vacation places. They would surely be taken from me. But the legislation passed, and the transition was upon us. Things began to go wrong. My daughter's grades had begun to slip, and her attitude toward her mother and me was becoming surly. My older boy was talking about dropping out of school. My wife said she didn't like the kids my daughter was hanging out with. Finally, my wife caught her stealing money from her purse and grounded her for a week. My daughter was supposed to come directly home immediately after school and stay there. That was when my daughter left home one night and disappeared. We were frantic. We searched her room and found indications that she was using drugs. Our older boy confessed that he had gotten her started on them about 6 months before. We called in the police after the required waiting period, but they seemed to be no help at all. We struggled on, but the days passed in a haze of worry. We had to move out of our house due to the depression and my drop in income since we could no longer pay for it. We decided to take a smaller house. It turned out that we were able to get enough from the equity in the big house and the vacation places that we could buy a modest 4-bedroom place. About a month after the transition, we got word from the computer system that our daughter was in a city about 500 miles from where we lived. We left the boys with some friends and hurried to our daughter. She had gotten an account for some reason. Certainly she had little enough money at the transition to put in it, and I don't know if she ever earned any money before we arrived. But when she identified herself to the computer, it recognized that she was our daughter and underage. She was in pretty bad condition from drug withdrawals and from not taking care of herself. She had turned to prostitution shortly after leaving home, and her pimp had treated her pretty roughly. After the transition, he'd tried to get her to work for luxury items, but that just didn't work out, so he left her. She was still strung out for a couple of weeks on the drugs she had left, but by the time we got to her, she had been going through withdrawal for several days, had not eaten anything for quite a while, and was dehydrated. We called a hospital, and they sent an ambulance. Do you know, she'd not even washed the garish makeup off her face since she had last gone out to offer her body? She was ghastly, and she smelled terrible. It literally made me vomit. Her mother was much stronger than I, and though pale, managed to give her some water and hold her. They talked quietly for a time while I was in the bathroom. Her mother and I sat in the hospital with nothing to do but think. She told me what our daughter had been through. She also told me that she had found our daughter's diary in her suitcase as she packed it for the hospital. She let me read it. At first the entries showed only the ordinary concerns of a girl in middle or high school, but they began to change about a year before. She had noticed the difference between what I said in church and on the radio and how we lived. She had seen me beg for the widow's mite and spend it on myself. She lost all respect for me and was ashamed to be my daughter. She lost interest in school and cheerleading. She changed the people she hung out with to a group that was angry at their parents and rejecting of their ideals. Her brother gave her some drugs, and she found release in the high. It wasn't long before she was dating the guys who would give her drugs and gave them sex in return. When that failed her, she resorted to stealing from her mother's purse, but after a time her mother caught her. The beginnings of withdrawal and the isolation from her friends were too much for her, so she escaped. Even when things were at their worst, she wouldn't call home. The idea of living with us was too unpleasant for her. She preferred the beatings by her pimp to my hypocrisy. At least he was honest in his exploitation of her. She felt free to hate him. She was supposed to love me, and she couldn't do that. That night I got a little taste of the tortures of the damned. Remorse flooded me. Guilt, shame, and self-loathing were my constant companions for a time. In a couple of days she had improved enough that we could take her to our new house. I think, in a way, it was good that we weren't in the old neighborhood and the old house. The change in scenery may have made it easier for her to endure being with us again. That next Sunday, I prepared a sermon which said nothing about what had happened. I did it almost without thinking. At the service, I went through the ritual almost mindlessly until it came time for the prayer. As always, I raised my hands and said, "Let us pray." Nothing came out. I was mute. How could I call upon God in that condition of sin? After a time, I dropped my arms. I looked at the people of my congregation, those honest, earnest faces of true believers. I was the least of them. I was not fit to wash their feet. Yet I wore expensive robes while they wore the plain and simple garb of the working poor. I was so embarrassed, so ashamed of myself, that I could no longer stand before them. I came out from behind the lectern and fell to my knees before the altar. Without uttering a word, I went forward on my belly, crying brokenly, my hands outstretched to the cross. It was as if my whole life was worthless and doomed. I would readily have ended my life then and there had there been some easy means to do so, but somehow, in my mind, I could see the Lord on that cross and hear his words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I felt judged and forgiven. I felt cleansed. I didn't feel happy or peace or exultation. I was not a new man. But I did know that I would have to become a new man, for I could never again stand to be what I was. I don't know why, but not a word had been spoken while I lay before the altar. Nobody seemed to move. When I got to my feet and faced the congregation, it seemed as if everyone was still right where they had been when I had last seen them. It was as if time had stood still while I experienced my epiphany. I looked at them and said, "We have to make some changes, starting with me." I then told them that I would not accept any gifts of luxury items from them ever again, that I had already accepted far too much from their hands. I swore to live as the least among them lived, and I have done so. I swore to finish building the church with my own hands, as much as I could, and I did that too. For some reason, the church was finished much faster when it was the congregation that built with contributed tools and materials. As I looked at them, and they looked at me, I seemed to see them differently somehow. I saw people who were stronger than I, who deserved the luxuries I had taken from them. I saw people to whom I owed a great debt. They weren't people to be cheated or bilked or scammed. They were people who could have and should have been my friends. They had trusted me and cared for me and followed me, even as I had betrayed them. In the weeks and months that followed, I found that I could not preach nor pray in public. The few times that I tried, the overwhelming guilt and shame would make me almost physically ill, and I could not choke out the words. My pastoral counseling, on the other hand, improved greatly. At home, my relationship with the children changed. Rather than send them to school, I undertook their education while my wife worked. Oddly, it seemed to me she had no problems at all finding things to do. It was as if a great torrent of pent-up energy sprang from her. She was organizing other people and getting materials together and doing all sorts of things. At first, she worked out of our house, but before long she was given an office in a nearby shopping center, and she began to get paid some significant amounts of money. As my time with the children increased, I began to see them as people and learn about them. I would take them to church with me because they could study there without distraction. I began the long and difficult process of winning the respect of my daughter and older son. They were put to work by their mother. She had them helping her in the afternoons. It was not long before they, too, were earning money. My daughter is now free of the drugs because they simply are not available. Young people in my congregation also started working, even the children in some cases. It was not as if they were doing regular 9-to-5 jobs, but they found things to do to earn money. They cleaned up the neighborhood and painted and repaired. They did things for some of our older church members. After a time, it seemed like they spent half their time trying to find ways to be good to other people. The change in the congregation was quite apparent as well. They were far better dressed, and there was far less complaining about health problems. They couldn't tithe, but they could spend time helping others instead. This suggestion, I am proud to say, was my own. The Lord, I believe, would far rather have 10% of their labor go to helping others than go to building a larger building. Though I now avoided all luxuries and never even looked at my account balance, I found life far more satisfying. I stopped worrying about money matters altogether. Then one day I realized that all the improvements in my life had come about because of the transition to the new money. The hospital that treated my daughter had not asked anything about our ability to pay. They just did what they could for her. I no longer had to worry about providing for my family, since their needs would be met whether I were meeting them or not. My congregation was healthier and happier and had far less stress. The marriages that had been in trouble either broke up almost right away after the transition, or for lack of money to argue about, improved. No husband thought his wife stayed with him just for the money. No abused wife had to stay with her husband. No mother had to work outside the home to support her children. The elderly no longer worried about whether they could afford the drugs they needed. Even my own children were learning to help others now that I was setting them a good example. Today, my wife is a coordinator with an excellent reputation. My daughter is a mother of her own family and has a husband I can respect. My sons are making a good living, each in his own way. For them, this story has a happy ending. But for me, it's not over yet. For me, I see God's hand in this new money. I have really read the Bible these years since the transition. Whereas before I read it looking for reasons why people should give me money, I later began to read it looking for God's message to me. Not so much in the words, but in my heart. As I read the passages about money, it seemed to me that those who sought money were some of the worst of the characters in the Bible. Jesus was angry at the money changers in the temple. He told the rich young ruler to give his money to the poor. He told the tax collector to return the money he had taken falsely. Yet, with the new money, I saw people doing so many good things for each other. I saw that those who were rich were among the best. It seemed to me that this new money was a root of much that was good. When somebody performed some act of kindness, I couldn't tell whether it was from greed or benevolence. Both the greedy and the kindly were acting in the same way. It seems to me that money is now a good thing because of the payers. The payers have made our money moral. The payers have converted us from a greedy, grasping, lying, cheating, robbing, murdering people into a people who care for others as they care for themselves. We love one another. We do unto others as we would have them do unto us. This money saved my son and daughter, and probably saved even me. Certainly I'm much more nearly the man God wants me to be now than I was before. I feel I must support the good works it brings about. The best way for me to help is to put my money where my mouth is. I feel called to become a payer, for that is God's will for me. I hope that someday, if I am a truly good payer, I'll be able to preach and pray in public again. I hope that I will wash this stain off my soul. I pray that I can accept God's forgiveness. So, you see before you a man much more deserving of your rejection. You see a man who almost destroyed his own children and betrayed the trust of hundreds of people. If you can find it in your hearts to forgive and tolerate me, how much more deserving is Neil of that same forgiveness and toleration? Is there one among you who is worthy to cast the first stone? Which of you is without sin? Which of you had anything bad to say about Neil before he of his own free will confessed the truth about his past? I did not. I saw only good in Neil. He is but mortal flesh and blood and is not perfect, but he is also our brother before God. His sins are surely our sins as well, for all of us will go before God undeserving of his blessings. As Oscar finished, he crossed the room and put his arms around Neil, kissed his cheek, and called him brother. There were several others who had a tear or two in their eyes, who also came forward to hug both Oscar and Neil. Before long, everyone in the room was on their feet, hugging each other and telling each other how much they cared for them. Neil had been in the emotional depths of fear and isolation and was now wrapped in love and affectionate words. He felt as though he was no longer mentally in captivity. The paranoia which had been his constant companion for years was dissipating. He experienced the feeling that he was truly home at last. The acceptance that had been his at Brianna's apartment, in the little town of Aldi, in Los Alamos, and here in this barracks, was finally getting through to his emotions. Finally, he could feel safe. Neil went to Oscar and gave him a big hug. He then held Oscar by his upper arms, looked up into his face, and said, "You are able to preach in public, Oscar. You just gave a magnificent sermon. Your congregation may have been only a handful of people, but your message was a powerful one." Oscar's eyes were filled with tears, and all he could do was nod. Niles slept better than he had for years and awoke in the morning feeling great. Then he remembered that he was going to have to face Mr. Sharp today about supply and demand. He had better do some thinking. Everybody knew that the greater the demand, the higher the price, and the lower the price, the greater the demand. No, wait, that didn't make sense. Try it again, simply. If the supply increased, the price should go down, and if the supply decreased, the price should go up. Yeah, that was it. If the price increases, the sale should decrease, and if the price decreases, the sale should increase. But which one caused the other? Did the supply cause the changes in price, or did the price cause changes in the supply? Maybe it worked both ways at the same time. Maybe they influenced each other. Or maybe whichever one changed first had that effect on the other, but then when the other changed in response, it had an effect on the former. Wait, that's a feedback loop. We're talking about a thermostat type of thing. The price responds to perturbations in the supply in a way that restores stability to the system. If the price changes, the supply responds to restore stability to the system. Okay, so in a POM free market, there's stability despite the variety of things that happen in the real world to change supplies and prices, and it all happens without any individual having to understand it and without any individual being in control of it. Now, what does that have to do with the payers? Where's the feedback loop for them? There can't be a feedback loop in the prices of luxuries since those don't change. So if the loop isn't there when money is spent, perhaps it is there when money is earned. Okay, what are the payers buying by crediting accounts? Presumably they're buying net benefit. But what's the price of net benefit? How can anyone know how much benefit is done to someone else? Hell, I couldn't even say how much benefit something is that benefits me. You can't measure something like that. And even if you could know something like that, how would you put a dollar amount on it? No, it just doesn't make sense. The prices of luxuries don't change, so there can't be a supply-demand feedback loop, and you can't tell what the prices are of the net benefits. That's all there is to it. Both ends closed off. I think I have him this time. Right. No way out of that argument. On the other hand, they tell me he's been teaching this course for years. He must have something in mind. I know I'm not perfect. Maybe there was something I didn't think of. Maybe there's another angle to it. Think, darn it. Okay, it can't be the luxuries. That's a dead end. It would have to be on the other side in the payments to the workers. The workers are paid for the net benefit. No, wait. The payers don't have to pay for net benefit. They can pay for whatever they want to. So what do they want to pay for? What motivates a payer? I know what motivates Oscar. He wants to be a good payer, whatever that is. What does a good payer want? Benefits. Damn, right back where I started. Why does a good payer want benefits? So people will be happy. Why does a payer want people happy? So they'll be nice to the payers. So the payers are paying for their own benefits? Well, I guess that makes sense. The payers pay the workers to make the consumers happy, so the consumers will be nice to the payers. Well, that's a feedback loop. Does it qualify as a case of supply and demand? Let's see. The money the payers give to the workers has to be the prices. So that would make the consumer's treatment of the payers the thing in supply. If the supply of rewards to the payers goes down, there would have to be an increase in the price paid to make those people happy. No, let's make it more concrete. Let's say that the streets in a town are not being fixed. This makes the consumers unhappy. That would mean that the consumers would not be nice to the payers, so the payers pay more for the repairs that are being done to the streets. This should attract more workers to do that work. That makes the people happy again. Yes, that works. Let's see the other way. Let's say that people are nice to the payers, so the payers keep doing what they did before. There isn't any price change in that direction. If the consumers are even nicer to the payers don't change anything either. It seems to work only one way. Consumer unhappiness about something gets more money spent on that thing, but consumer happiness doesn't reduce the pay. Is that a feedback loop? It isn't symmetrical like the palm market feedback loop, but it is feedback. Okay, let's try from the worker's point of view. If there is X amount being spent to reward a certain kind of work, and the number of people doing that work increases, then the average pay per person goes down in that trade. That should cause people to leave that trade. If the amount of money for a trade like, say, bricklaying goes up, then the average pay to those in the trade goes up. That should attract more workers so that the average pay goes back down again. The supply of workers and the pay or price of workers, that's a feedback loop right there. It's even a complete loop, just like in the palm free market. Okay, that's two feedback loops that are supply and demand. Perhaps there are more. What about the supply of payers? They get the necessities without having to pay for them, but what constitutes a necessity? That can change. If the supply of payers is too small, some luxuries can be relabeled as necessities. If the supply of payers is too large, some necessities can be relabeled as luxuries. Of course, that's harder, but it can be done. That's a kind of feedback loop, even though there's no money involved. 3 supply and demand situations, each having its own feedback loop. Who would have thought? Noises in the hallway indicated that the others were going to breakfast. Neil got quickly out of bed, threw himself together, and hurried after them. He didn't intend to miss any more of their acceptance than he had to. When he got to the serving line, he could see that several members of last night's group were already seated at a table, and that the conversation seemed to be animated. As he approached, he heard, "I say he's just a fat slob who likes rubbing our faces into the luxuries he can afford," D.W. said. "But you have to admit he knows his stuff," Natalie countered. "He ain't so smart. He probably inherited money before the transition and has been living off that ever since." Clayton put in, "How can you say that, D.W.? Have you checked into his background?" "Well, no, but how many rich guys do you know who go around with a staff of body servants all the time?" "Good morning, Neil." "Good morning, Natalie. It's good to see everyone up bright and early this morning." There was a chorus of greetings from the others. "Neil, we've been discussing Mr. Sharp," Wendy informed him. "What do you think of him?" "I only know the obvious about him, what we saw in class." "Yes," D.W. said, "but what did you think of what you saw? Pretty disgusting, wasn't it?" "Well, it's the first time I ever saw somebody eat a meal while they were giving a lecture." "But did it detract from the points he was making?" Oscar asked. "I thought it was a rather entertaining sideshow, but it didn't take my mind off the points he was making about bureaucracy and the free market." "We can't trust a guy like that. He's a slob, and he would look the part if he didn't have all those obsequious servants around to wipe his chin and clean his clothes." D.W. was dead certain in his tone. "I wouldn't go that far, but I agree it's obvious that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and never had to do anything for himself," Layden said. "How can he understand the plight of the poor or how they feel about things? All his knowledge is theoretical out of books." "But this is a pretty theoretical topic, isn't it? What difference does it make if he understands what it means to be poor?" Wendy asked. "There's Brenda in the serving line. Let's go get her to tell us about Sharp." Neil stood up and waved at Brenda, who looked over and nodded in acceptance to Neil's pantomime invitation to join them. "Now we'll get the standard line from the administration," D.W. grumped. "Oh, pooh," Natalie said, grinning at D.W. "Brenda's played fair with us so far. I think she'll tell us the truth about Sharp, too." "Can we only learn from perfect people? Must the prophet be as perfect as his God?" Oscar asked in his best tent revival voice and a big grin. "We have to judge whether to believe people on their character as well as what they say," Oscar Layden commented. "Sharp's character certainly makes a difference in how I will interpret his words." "Brenda, we all noticed Mr. Sharp, as I'm sure you knew. What can you tell us about him?" Neil said as he rose and pulled out a chair for Brenda at the long table they all shared. "He's one of our best instructors. What do you want to know about him?" "Is he for real?" Clayton asked. The general round of laughter ended with Brenda saying, "He's as real as it gets. He's always been like you saw him yesterday for as long as I've known him, and that's going on 6 years now." "How did he get rich?" asked D.W., getting right to the point. "Cosmetics." "Cosmetics? Surely there's more to it than that," D.W. sputtered. "He was a diver for the petroleum industry in the Gulf of Mexico. He was interested in the plants growing on the oil rigs, so he harvested some and learned to grow them in a fish tank. It turned out that one of them contained a substance that could be used for removing wrinkles. Mr. Sharp was able to help them produce the substance in large quantities inexpensively." "That's all he did? Grow seaweed?" Layden asked incredulously. "On what basis does a payer pay?" Brenda asked calmly. "Net benefit," Layden said with her head down. "Does it matter how difficult it was to bring about?" "No." "Does it matter whether anyone else could have done it?" "No." Does it matter what the producer's character is? No. Then why ask the question? Because it doesn't seem fair, Layden pleaded. Other people work hard for years and don't get rich. Why should he get rich for playing around with a hobby? Why should he stay poor when so many people have benefited from what he did? Brenda, to shift the topic a little, Neil put in, why does he have all those servants? Why does he eat and drink during the class? None of the other instructors do that, even the ones who aren't payers. I think he just doesn't want to go all that time without enjoying his pleasures. After all, it's his money. He can spend it however he likes. Then how come he had only the one beer? It looked to me like he wanted more than just one, Natalie asked. He's an alcoholic, Brenda said. Then why let him have any beer at all, Neil asked. It's his money. If he wants to buy beer, he can buy beer, Oscar answered. But they only let him have one, Neil pointed out. If they let him have several at a time, he might get drunk and hurt someone, Natalie said. But, Neil said, they let him have all the food he wanted, even though he's obviously overweight and under-exercised. That's because he's only hurting himself. It's his body and his life, and if he wants to do himself in by overeating, it's his choice, Natalie warmed to the debate. But look at those consequences, Neil said. Look at the net benefits. Here we have a person who has made a major contribution and who may make other contributions being allowed to ruin his health by eating too much. Look at the consequences of trying to stop him, Natalie asserted. Who would you have make that decision for him? Who would enforce such a ruling? You would have us presume to make his life decisions for him. But no one is obligated to give him or sell to him the tools, food in this case, by which to ruin his life. Doesn't that reduce the pay for anyone selling him more food than he needs? Neil continued. It's his life, Natalie maintained, almost nose-to-nose with Neil. If you were giving him necessity food in overabundance, then you'd be held responsible for his eating too much. But in this case, he is buying luxury food. Those are his choices. And unless someone sells him high-calorie food labeled as low-calorie or something like that, he's the only one responsible for what he does to himself with his purchases. Brenda entered the discussion at this point. You see, Neil, if we try to tell people how to spend their money, we are denying them any responsibility for their own lives. If Mr. Sharp dies of his overweight condition, no one else will be to blame. If we try to control his eating, then we assume responsibility for his eating and can rightly be blamed if he eats too much or the wrong things. I don't think anyone wants the responsibility for any other adult's self-destructive actions. And even if they do, the rest of us won't support their taking our freedom in the name of protecting someone else. But what about that foot rub he got, D.W. put in. That was downright demeaning to that girl. It was humiliating. I was embarrassed for her. You shouldn't make people do things like that, especially in public. Hold on there, D.W. I didn't see anything demeaning about her massaging his feet, Wendy said. Do you see medical treatment as demeaning? That wasn't medical treatment. That was a reflection of slavery. I should think you of all people would be opposed to such a display. I thought she was beautiful in that costume, Clayton said. I think that costume made the foot treatment much more pleasant for Mr. Sharp. I know I certainly enjoyed it more as a result. Wendy held up her hand for a moment to command the attention of the others, and when they had quieted from their muffled laughter, she said to D.W., Do you consider the costumes of doctors and nurses and policemen and others to be demeaning? Of course not. That would be silly. Those are uniforms of respect. Isn't a dancer's costume a costume of respect? Don't you respect dancers? Now, don't try to pull that on me, Wendy. I never said anything like that. You implied that, whether you intended it or not. I say that if she had come out in the uniform of a registered nurse, you would have thought about her entirely differently. You would have defined her as medical personnel and would have looked at what she did as treatment for a physical ailment. Wendy was getting a little heated. I think that you saw her costume and defined her as a dancer from a strange land who is at the feet of a powerful white man, and you thought of her as a prostitute or worse because of that. I never, D.W. began. How else would you call her medical treatment of Mr. Sharp demeaning unless you saw it as a sexual exploitation? Hold on, everybody sit quietly for a moment to regain your composure. Brenda was leaning forward in her chair, her food forgotten. I'm going to take this as a teaching moment, so everybody get into student mode and try to learn from this. She paused and waited while each person settled back into less agitated positions. First, your duty as payers has nothing to do with judging anything except consequences. If somebody wants to do their job in a clown suit or wearing a silly hat, it's no business of yours. Second, whether an act is demeaning or not is in the eye of the beholder. For example, in Semitic culture, one does not show someone else the bottom of one's foot unless one wishes to insult them, because the bottom of one's foot steps on all sorts of unclean things. Therefore, you can imagine how low one would have to be to wash someone else's feet. Yet Jesus did just that. Does any Christian feel that Jesus demeaned himself by doing so? I think not. Yet to some other observer who didn't know who the parties were and didn't know the context within which it happened, the action would be seen as demeaning, the act of a slave. Third, you must understand before you can judge. If you don't know what's going on, you can't evaluate either the people or their actions. We saw in the classroom a beautiful, yes, Clayton, I thought she was beautiful too, young woman who was caring for the feet of a man who had indicated that he was suffering from pain in his feet. Could this have been medical treatment? Yes, it could. Could it have been some sexual game? Yes, it could. Could it have been some sort of classroom demonstration of some principle of economics? Yes, it could. We don't know now what the situation was. We can't be sure we understand it. If we had to judge the parties involved right this minute, we would each have to do the best we could with inadequate information. But we don't have to judge now. We don't have to guess what was going on. We can recognize our ignorance of the situation and withhold judgment. This last point is a very difficult one for almost everyone, but it is especially important for payers to do this. It can be very embarrassing to a payer to rush to judgment and then be shown to have been in error. Producers can be justifiably quite angry when they produce benefit which is not recognized. Consumers are likewise irritated when they benefit and no one is rewarded as a result because they know that such benefit is not likely to be repeated. Now, as to this particular case with Mr. Sharp and the foot massage, what do we know about the situation? We know that a woman came in during class and worked on Mr. Sharp's feet, Layden said. We know she was wearing a costume that looked like it was from Southeast Asia, Oscar added. We know she had a case with bottles and jars of things that smelled good, Natalie said. We know that Mr. Sharp was being served by people who were wearing costumes that matched what they were doing. That is, Reggie wore at least 3 different outfits, and the waiters dressed their parts, Wendy said. Those will do for the physical aspects of the situation. What do we know about the social aspects of the situation, Brenda asked. It was supposed to be a class situation rather than a clinic or a cafe, D.W. said with some emphasis. Mr. Sharp said he was rich and not a payer, so we can assume that was probably true, Oscar said. Were any of the people serving Mr. Sharp slaves? Were any being threatened by weapons or persons wielding force? Brenda asked. There were several heads shaking no and some murmurs of negation. So can we say that the actions of the servants appeared to be voluntary? What do you say, D.W.? Okay, I agree they weren't slaves and they were working voluntarily, but what he had them doing was still degrading. Do any of you think they were going to get paid for what they were doing? Heads were nodding and there were several verbal agreements. So some payer or payers must think that what they were doing was bringing net benefit to our society. Do any of you think that what they were doing did not deserve to be paid? Clayton? D.W.? Neil? After a pause to give everyone a chance to respond, she continued, If what they were doing was producing benefit, how could it be degrading? Do you have an answer for that, D.W.? D.W. looked down and shook his head. Now, for the rest of you, I want you to be feeling smug and superior to D.W. so I can bring you back to earth. D.W.'s feelings are important and valid and are needed in the payers. D.W. should not feel in any way ashamed of those feelings. They are quite natural, and D.W. should not try to repress them. By this point, D.W.'s head had come up, and his face had an expression of surprise. Such feelings protect you and me and everyone else because they are a reflection of D.W.'s desire to protect the weak and powerless, Brenda went on earnestly. If you were feeling superior to D.W., I ask you, where is your conscience? Where is your empathy? Where is your human feeling of compassion for those less fortunate than yourself? By this time, D.W. almost had a smile on his face. The others at the table were not looking so happy. You must remember that all points of view, all ways of viewing the world, all kinds of values are important and needed among the payers. We would not have all the payers be the same, and we would not reject anyone for their attitudes, even if they are intolerant of the attitudes of others. We try to explain what the situation is and how things work to all those who choose to be trained here for paying so that they will be able to be successful in their own eyes. We are not here to filter out the undesirables. We are not here to reject anyone. We are also not here to miss class, and I see it's almost time to visit with Mr. Sharp." With that, the group broke up. Those who had gotten there later and had not finished eating began to hurry through their last few bites, and the others rose and took their trays to the dishwasher. Invisible Hand, Chapter 35, Return of the Fat Man, in which the supply of demand is fed back, looping unstably, or something like that. Neil came into class on a wave of mixed emotions. There was still the warmth of being accepted for himself, warts and all, from the night before. There was a sense of triumph for what he had thought out this morning about supply and demand. He also had some anxiety about how his ideas would be received, not only by the instructor, but also by his friends. Now he was becoming worried about offending them by pointing out the flaws in their utopia. This time he made it a point to sit in the front row, since he expected to be doing a lot of talking, and he didn't want the rest of the class to have to crane their necks to see him when he spoke. Once seated at the end of the row, he wondered if anyone else in history had ever concerned themselves with such a thought before. His emotions now had an overlay of feeling himself to be a little strange on top of all the other feelings. On this occasion, the instructor was preceded into the classroom by the recliner on its dolly and followed by a small portable table with what looked like a variety of snacks and several bottled drinks, none of which appeared to be alcoholic. He settled into the chair, carefully selected a snack, and took a huge bite, then chewed slowly, looking around the room as if they were all there only to eat. Having swallowed, wiped his mouth, and poured a drink from one of the bottles, he glanced at the clock and said, "Let us begin. As I warned you last time, we will today concern ourselves with the way supply and demand relationships shape the payer organization and its actions. I assume that you all have given considerable thought to this relationship." The members of the class glanced quickly at each other, remembering what they had been thinking about both last night and this morning at breakfast. "Therefore, I will limit my opening remarks to a few general points and expect you each to contribute to filling in the detail. Supply refers to goods or services available for exchange. Demand refers to the price people are willing to pay for those goods or services. In order to talk about supply and demand, therefore, we need to be explicit about what the goods or services are and about how the price is measured. You will note that price is always expressed in terms of money. This will be true even when the goods that are referred to by supply are monetary units or monies. Supply and demand is a specific instance of what more generally can be called feedback. For example, our hands report what they sense to the brain. If the object being touched is hot or cold or sharp, the brain may have the hand pull back or drop the object. If the object is warm or smooth or soft, the brain may have the hand increase the touching. This is a case of simple feedback. But there is also what one would call dual feedback, or a feedback loop in which two agents give feedback to each other. Nature is filled with feedback, and there exist many feedback loops of incredible complexity in the ecosystem. Human beings have recognized feedback loops in many ways. The concept of punishment for behavior we don't like, for example, is an attempt to provide feedback in the expectation that such feedback will result in a decrease in the unwanted behavior. Mr. Sharp was beginning to smack his lips again, so he paused and addressed his interest to the partially eaten snack just before him. After a couple of bites and another few gulps of soda, perhaps a third of the bottle, he continued, "Economists have noticed a particularly interesting form of feedback in market activity in the relationship between prices and the supply of goods of various types. Therefore, we talk frequently today about supply and demand when we discuss economics. The relationship between supply and demand in economics seems to assume that there exists a free market. Of course, in palm economies, that's almost never true. There are almost always governmental or other agencies which intrude into the market. But the tendencies and influences of supply and demand exist even in the absence of a free market. They are so powerful that they will always create a black market whenever some agency attempts to prevent or resist their influences. Therefore, it would be foolish of us to assume that there is no feedback in our economy. It would also be foolish to assume that there are no feedback loops. So, we will assume that there are some. My first question is, what effects can feedback loops have on a system?" Dead silence was the response. Worried glances passed among the class members, and then a lot of people were looking down at their desks so that the instructor saw most of the tops of heads. Needless to say, Mr. Sharp took advantage of this pause to refill his glass as well as his plate. Neil thought, I sat up front to talk, so I had better say something. I think they could be either stabilizing or destabilizing. That is, I can imagine supply and demand keeping prices and supplies stable, but I can also imagine a feedback loop generating instability. Okay, that's a start. Now, what characteristics would you expect a feedback loop which was generating instability to have? I know. If an increase in one factor caused an increase in another factor, which caused an increase in the first factor, Natalie said, like before World War I, when each nation's mobilization convinced the other nations that they were going to attack, and then, to get an advantage, one of the nations attacked first, since it was obvious that the other nation would attack anyway. Or like a disagreement between a husband and wife can escalate as each shows signs of anger which make the other person angry too, and before you know it, they're yelling and throwing things, Oscar said. Those are good examples, the instructor said. But can you give an example from economics? The Great Depression is an example, Layden said. When the economy slowed in the United States after the 1920s boom, a few banks failed. This contracted the money supply, so more banks failed. The process continued back and forth, resulting in a deflation and joblessness. It took years to get out of that mess. Germany after World War I had runaway inflation, Clayton put in. They just kept printing larger numbers on their bills. I think it had something to do with the war debts. Neil said, when employment falls, income and spending fall. This results in lower sales. This results in less demand. This results in more layoffs and less employment. You can even express that one in terms of supply and demand. As demand falls, the supply falls. And since the demand is a function of the supply through wages, which are another supply and demand relationship, the demand falls again. Damn, I was almost incoherent on that one, Neil thought, his face warming. I'll have to do better or sit quietly in the back. Good enough, people, said Mr. Sharp, plying his napkin. If the causal relationship is positive for both factors, or negative for both factors, the relationship will be unstable. If the relationship is negative for one and positive for the other, then the relationship tends to be stable. If a reduction in A causes a reduction in B, and a reduction in B causes a reduction in A, there will be instability. If a reduction in A causes an increase in B, and an increase in B causes an increase in A, then you tend to have stability. Now, can you give me examples of stability produced by feedback loops? A thermostat does that. If the temperature falls, the thermostat increases the heating. If the temperature rises, the thermostat reduces the heating. Of course, you reverse that with cooling, D.W. said. Clouds increase when the temperature gets higher, and that decreases the amount of sunshine getting to the earth, which allows things to cool. A contribution from Natalie. Anything from economics? Didn't they try to set interest rates higher or lower to keep the economy stable? Oscar asked. Yeah, but it didn't work all that well. The economy was so dependent on what was happening in the rest of the world that they really couldn't control it, Layden said. Doesn't the POM free market keep both prices and supply stable? Neil asked and tried to answer his own question. After all, an increase in supply lowers prices, and a reduction in price lowers supply. That would be an inverse relationship between supply and price when supply is doing the causing, and a direct relationship between price and supply when price is doing the causing. We should be able to explain all the cases in which the market is unstable, that is, inflation or deflation, as a result of the interference of the government and monopolies and such. That is, if the market isn't free, it can't function to maintain stability. What about when supply is reduced due to natural causes, like a drought reducing agricultural production? The Dust Bowl of the 1920s had something to do with starting the Great Depression, Natalie pointed out. Wouldn't that start one of the unstable feedback loops? And wouldn't such a loop have a big effect on supply and demand? But the Great Depression was caused by government intervention in banking and such, not by the Dust Bowl, according to my father, Clayton replied. Natalie came back with, small banks are very dependent on local conditions. If a small bank in a small town has lots of loans out to local farmers and local businesses that depend on those farmers and to local people for home loans, it would be very simple and highly likely that a drought that affected the farmers would also ruin businesses, and people would lose their jobs in those businesses and not be able to make their house payments. With all those loans defaulting at once, the bank could very easily go under. That would make things even worse because a lot of local people would have lost their money. Oscar said, I think the palm free market is only a stabilizing force when conditions are relatively stable anyway. I think it can be overwhelmed relatively easily by governments and monopolies and wars and droughts and such. I think it's too dependent on the proper conditions to be robust. Class, Mr. Sharp said, coming up from a long drink of what appeared to be root beer, you are all making good points, but we need some factor that explains the relative stability of our economy in comparison with the palm economies. Then the instructor settled back in his chair and selected another grape. Natalie said, I think it may be because in our economy some of the palm feedback loops are broken. For example, in a palm economy, when people stop buying a certain item, the producers of that item lose their jobs. Therefore, they lose income and stop spending as much. This causes others to lose income and so on in a negative loop that's destabilizing. In our economy, if an item stops being used, it doesn't affect the amount of money being paid. If the items are luxuries, there's still money to buy them, and such excess money doesn't cause price changes for the other luxuries, so there's no loop there. If the items people aren't consuming are necessities, then they must be surplus and we should stop making them, so it's appropriate to stop producing them. If the items are capital goods, then we're doing fine without them, so they should no longer be made. Therefore, all the destabilizing loops that might cause trouble in a palm economy don't function in our economy. Layden said, didn't Mr. Sharp just say that there were feedback loops in our economy and in the payer organization? Yes, Layden, he did, Natalie replied, but those only involve money in one direction, not both. That is, since only the payers can pay, the people they're paying can't give the money to someone else in some other feedback loop. Therefore, the feedback only involves money in one direction, from payer to producer. Whatever feedback comes to the payers as a result of their payments isn't in the form of money. In a palm economy, a change in movement of money generates feedback that's also a movement of money. Since palm money is independent of the goods for sale, there's nothing preventing a wild oscillation. Very good, Natalie. Mr. Sharp was actually smiling. In most of my classes, no one gets that aspect, and I have to explain it. Now, does anyone have any other factor that might provide stability? And he took a particularly beautiful cupcake and carefully, almost tenderly, began to pull the pleats out of the cup. Clayton sat up suddenly. Haven't they been telling us that three-party interactions are more stable than two-party interactions? The fact that there are three parties to all our money transactions should make them more stable. In a palm economy, if you get an advantage, you can use the money that advantage generates to get still further advantages, like when a successful business uses its money to buy lobbyists to get legislation to give them still more advantages. Yes, Layden said. And when the people at the bottom stop having money to spend, it starts feedback loops that cause the whole economy to slow down. Since the wealthy and powerful are in control, they let hardly any money into the hands of the poor, and things keep getting worse until the whole thing falls apart. It isn't that simple, Layden, but that's the general idea, Mr. Sharp said, grinning. What's so stable about the three-party interaction? D.W. asked. Well, Oscar replied, the one party dominates another party, and that party dominates a third party, and that third party dominates the first party. No one party can dominate both the others. That way they can have mutually rewarding interactions indefinitely. In our case, the payers dominate the producers by controlling the money. The producers control the consumers by determining what is produced and who can have it. And the consumers dominate the payers because the payers live among them and need their social rewards. Each group is kept from taking over by the group that dominates it. It's like the old game of rock, paper, and scissors. So, Neil said, though external forces may limit or reduce production, there's always a money reward for benefiting others. The flow of goods and services from producers to consumers and payers is matched by a flow of money and luxuries to the producers. Therefore, a lack of money is never the reason that something worthwhile cannot be done. Class, you have resolved too many issues too quickly, so you'll have to endure a lecture. With this announcement, Mr. Sharp pushed aside the litter of empty containers on the table in front of him. You are correct that it is the breaking of the destabilizing feedback loops that makes our economy more stable than the palm economies. You are also correct that the three-party nature of the basic economic relationships keeps any one group from dominating the economy. You can see these influences at work in the payer organization. Most of what you will do as payers is collect and share information. There will be others to help you with this, but since you are the ones who will suffer from failure in this data collection, you'll want similarly motivated people to gather the data you need. This data is the feedback you'll use to make decisions about payments. Your motivation for wanting things to go smoothly, making the general public happy, is that only then will you get the respect and attention that you crave from the public. Your experience of how people treat you and what they complain to you about will keep you on the proper path, whether you like it or not. This is another source of feedback to you. This feedback serves as your conscience. It will be as good as the public is good and as bad as the public is bad. If you allow the short-sighted, fearful, irrational demands that will be made upon you to control your actions, you will suffer in the longer term. If you stand firm and do the right thing despite the foolishness of your friends and acquaintances in the public, it will do you no good because most of the other payers will give in to it. The public will get what they deserve. But if they suffer, even though they'll deserve it, they'll make you suffer too. So what can a payer do? Alone she can do very little. That's why the payers must cooperate. That's why it's so important that anyone who wants to be a payer can be one, at least for the time being. The payer organization must be diverse, or it will listen to only a little of the feedback it needs. It must be diverse, or it will think of only a few solutions to the problems that the organization will inevitably face. It must be composed of freely cooperating people, or its decisions will become ignorant and foolish. So what you can do is do what you must do. The system will make you do the right things, whether you will it or not. The system will not pass a law or hold a gun on you. It will not threaten you with a fate worse than death. But you will find the system almost irresistible, because the feedback you will get will entice you. It will scare you. It will inspire you. It will tempt you. It will act upon you in ways you are not even yet aware of. And that's good. If you could resist the system, you could destroy the system, just as the system will destroy itself if it ever fails the society. So don't worry too much about having to be right all the time. Do the best you can and sleep peacefully, because you don't have to be perfect for everything to be okay. Now that you have an idea of how the payer organization is controlled and shaped and kept in line, let's look at how it manages to do its job. Let's look at the techniques it uses to do its part in the smooth functioning of the economy. The first thing is allocations of resources. We've pointed out how the organization and its decision-making apparatus is influenced by free market forces and the various feedback loops. But how are the actual decisions made that determine who gets to use what resources and to what ends? My first question is, who makes the allocation decisions in a free market economy? Nobody, some people said, and others said, everybody. Correct! The market interactions, those beautiful and terrifying feedback loops, make the decisions. No, they aren't people, they are processes. But the results of those processes are the same as if some incredible and nearly omniscient supermind were making the decisions. The amount of information being processed in those millions of free market decisions is prodigious, and the result is distributed computing at its best. In this way, the resources of the society are allocated by those who own those resources. Each person is trying to do what will generate the results they desire. In so doing, they gratify the needs and desires of others. Now, tell me some examples of this process with respect to particular resources. Layden's hand shot up. Labor is a scarce resource. Those who are not very good at a particular task get paid little for doing that work, so they are motivated to move on to something else they can do better. In this way, people tend to end up doing the things they do best. D.W. was next. As the supply of a particular metal is reduced, the cost to the society of using it in products increases, and therefore the rewards to those who employ it are reduced. This provides a motivation to use other materials in its place or other products to perform the same functions. The result is that the use of the hard-to-find metal is reduced. Neil, thinking that he had better say something or be left out of the class discussion he had thought he was going to dominate, said, "There are many kinds of breads made from a variety of grains. If people prefer certain grains and certain breads, those will be consumed, and there will be unused breads and grains of those not preferred. Therefore, those who produce those grains and breads will be paid less. They will shift their efforts toward the more popular breads and grains. Thus, the market will influence the amount of land planted in those grains and the amount of each kind of bread being made." "Who makes the decisions as to the ores and grains and breads?" Mr. Sharp demanded. Oscar said, "The owners do. If anyone else did, they'd be operating with less information and likely also with less motivation to make good decisions." "What if an owner makes a bad decision?" Mr. Sharp asked with a raised eyebrow. "He doesn't get paid and people are reluctant to cooperate with him," Oscar replied. "Wouldn't that bad decision wreck the economy?" No, because no single owner owns a very large part of the ore, grain, or bread, Layton said. This is true of all the material resources. At most, a given individual might own 1%. Why can't one person corner the market on some resource? I know, Natalie squeaked, because capital is given, not bought. It's the people who control the resources that own them, and no one person can control very much of any resource. Therefore, Oscar said, resources are allocated by everyone who owns or controls a resource. The process by which the society allocates resources is the free market. What do the payers make decisions about? How much net benefit was accomplished and who should get credit for it, Wendy said. What else do they decide? What things are to be called luxuries? Anything else? What about how resources are to be used, or where to place roads, or where buildings should be built? Natalie said, Payers don't make those decisions. They only observe and judge. They have no authority over anything except paying. I think you are ready to serve as apprentices now. Class dismissed, Mr. Sharp said almost in benediction, and raised his hand accordingly. Reggie!
Thank you for attending today's presentation of Invisible Hand by Larry K. Mason, brought to you by gaytalkradio.org and queerpublicradio.com. We hope you will join us tomorrow as the story continues at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and 6 p.m. Pacific Time. In case you've missed any of the episodes, you may listen to them by visiting queerpublicradio.com or by visiting Mr. Mason's website at www.nopom.info. That's www.nopom.info. Thank you for joining us, and as always, we wish the best to you and yours.